This short video is about the protests against the violence towards women and the reaction of the Prime Minister in Australia. He acted like a complete donkey, and I'm going to tell you why. Why I'm negative.
Back to the story. Website got some top stories. Helps people like me stop doing stupid things.
I'm recording this on a very hot day. I'm in Queensland and it's still very hot, so I'm sweating like crazy. It's also the day after demonstrations that happened across Australia which were protesting violence against women. This was mostly triggered by two events here in Australia. One was where there was a rape allegation made against the Australian Attorney General, Christian Porter. It's been claimed that he raped a woman in the late 1980s. And the second event was a rape allegation made by Brittany Higgins against a staffer in the Australian government. And it's alleged that Brittany Higgins was raped in a minister's office in the Parliament building here in Australia. The Australian Prime Minister completely mishandled the response to these events. Regarding the rape allegation against the Attorney General, he backed his Attorney General and said he believed Christian Porter when Christian Porter told him he didn't do it. Previously, the PM had said that when women reported sexual violence, they should be heard and should be believed. So it appears that his statement about believing women when they tell stories about sexual violence doesn't apply when that sexual violence is reported against one of his chums. In the case of Brittany Higgins, the rape allegation was handled really badly by his ministers. They essentially seemed to treat the rape as a political embarrassment that needed to be hushed up, and the PM seemed not to take the whole thing very seriously. Then, after he got a lot of criticism for his response, for not responding to what had happened to Brittany in a way that actually reflected the horror of what had happened to her, he came out of his office all sheepish and he announced,
I have listened to Brittany.
Yay. That's good. But then he explained why he decided he needed to take it more seriously than he initially did. Apparently, it was all thanks to his wife, Jenny.
Jenny and I spoke last night, and she said to me, you have to think about this as a father first. What would you want to happen if it were our girls? Jenny has a way of clarifying things, always has.
Well, that's certainly clarified things for us, and it's a shocker. Essentially, he said he could only take what had happened to Brittany seriously once he imagined Brittany could have been one of his daughters. The implication is that if anyone other than his daughter gets raped, he couldn't really give a stuff. The more general worry is that he seems to be saying that when something so horrific happens to a person, he won't be able to empathise or understand that horror or to be moved or feel a sense of compassion unless it's a thing that happens to someone close to him. Now remember, it wasn't that hard for him to imagine Brittany Higgins as his daughter. It wouldn't have taken him a huge amount of effort because Brittany is white, appears to be middle class, and it's easy to imagine either of his daughters, the Prime Minister's daughters, growing up to be very much like Brittany because they're white and from a middle class family. The PM might have a harder job sympathising with, say, a black working class woman who neither of his daughters will grow up to become. Now, he gave that statement back on February 19th. Now, a few days ago, the issue became centre stage again when people gathered across Australia to protest violence against women. And on the morning of those protests, the Deputy PM, Michael McCormack, was confronted by one of the protest organisers, Janine Hendry. And this was after the protesters had asked for the PM and Cabinet colleagues to meet with them at the protest which was happening on the lawns outside of Parliament House. The PM and the Deputy PM both said no, they wouldn't. And the PM said that a small group of the protesters could meet him in his office, in the PM's office, if they wanted to. Now have a listen to the exchange between Janine Hendry and Michael McCormack.
After we've heard the women of Australia that you will take responsibility for starting to enact some of the structural and systemic changes that we need not only in Parliament but throughout our major institutions.
I've always made those commitments. I've always made sure that any workplace that I've been in, and certainly my home, is a very safe and secure place for any woman who happens to be in that particular environment.
I understand that you may have in your home, but there are many women that work in many organisations who do not feel safe. And we are asking today for certainly some structural reform that is actually within your power to implement the appropriate laws and regulations
and the Prime Minister,
in
I think, has
Australia.
given that assurance that he will meet with you and discuss any submissions, of course, and anything that you would like to put forward. And of course, we'll look at that.
So Janine Hendry had to remind the Deputy Prime Minister that he's the Deputy Prime Minister, that he actually holds an office of political power. And that's in response to the Deputy Prime Minister responding to Janine calling out the problem of violence against women by essentially saying, look, I don't hit women. look, hey fella, she's not asking you that. She's asking you as a senior politician to support legislation to protect women from sexual violence. And it doesn't matter if you don't slap women around, thank God that you don't, but it's not about you. And this is another iteration of that same thing. You know, if it doesn't affect them, they don't understand why it's an issue. And this is giving us an insight into that sort of thinking that causes all of the problems. We have a group of privileged white men who assume everyone is like them, and for those people who aren't like them, well, it takes quite a few gear shifts for them to get to the point of walking in those other people's shoes, if they get there at all. And that's why it's easy for them to enact policies that hurt women, hurt black people, hurt working class people, because if that is who you are, they don't see you, they don't feel your pain, they're living in their own little cocoon, and they only really get riled up if something hurts them and the people in their cocoon. Now, the other alarming thing about all of this is the invite the PM made to meet a small delegation of the protesters. You know, he invited them into Parliament to meet him in his office. And that's because the Prime Minister didn't want to meet the protesters outside of Parliament building. And what's the problem with that? Well, these protesters were calling for legislative reform to make society safer for women, and they were responding to the allegation by Brittany Higgins that she had been raped in Parliament House. They were saying, hey, even in Parliament, women are not safe from sexual violence. So what does the PM do? He invites those women into Parliament, and not just that, but invites them into his ministerial office, the very bit of Parliament building where the woman was allegedly raped. So what a donkey. You know, Parliament might be a nice, safe, cosy space for the PM to work in, but it wasn't for Brittany Higgins to work in, and it isn't for a lot of women. And that was what part of that protest was about. Oh, and the other reason he wanted them to come to his office, because he felt safe there, safer than outside where the protest was happening. Well, it's because the PM's office contains all the symbols of power. You know, it's happened to me. I got invited to meet the UK Prime Minister when I went to 10 Downing Street. And when that happened, when I went into 10 Downing Street, I transformed from an angry social activist to a meek, timid, very well-behaved little servant of the state. I was intimidated by the setting because there's all the trappings of power there to remind you how much power they had and how little you had. And that's why people like that invite you into their offices, not because it's extending a hand of friendship, but it's because they know that the surroundings will intimidate you. You know, intimidate you with the marble flooring, the grand staircases, the portraits and statues, all that ceremonial gunk in those buildings. That's why it's there. So if you're not part of that class of people, the privileged people, it's likely you're going to get a little bit intimidated by that setting. Not all of us do, but people like me do. Timid little creatures like me. And it's a setting where the Prime Minister is in control. You know, he gets to decide if anyone films the conversation, records the conversation. He decides who's allowed in the room and so on. Anywho, Now to my last point. So the PM won't go out to meet the protesters. And that day at Prime Minister Question Time, he acknowledged the protesters, and he does this in his opening comments to Parliament.
Today, here and in many cities across our country, women and men are gathering together in rallies, both large and small, to call for change and to act against violence directed towards women. It is good and right, Mr. Speaker, that so many are able to gather here in this way, whether in our capital or elsewhere, and to do so peacefully to express their concerns and their very genuine and real frustrations. This is a vibrant liberal democracy, Mr. Speaker. Not far from here, such marches, even now, are being met with bullets, but not here in this country, Mr. Speaker. Not here in this country. This is a triumph of democracy when we see these things take place.
So, oh my God. Yes, he actually said that. Why did he feel the need to remind those people protesting violence against women that they would be shot if they were doing that in another country? That is just such a stupid thing to say. And how could he have not anticipated the outrage it would have caused? And it did cause. It caused a lot of outrage, quite rightly. Now, who knows why he said what he said? He said he just did it to remind people how lucky we are to live in a democracy like Australia. We just got to hope that he wasn't giving out a dog whistle to people, if you know what I mean. But what we do know is that politicians often use that line of how wonderful it is seeing people exercising their democratic right to peacefully protest when the protest is about something that the politician doesn't agree with. You know, it's that thing where you say, look, I don't agree with your point, but I defend your right to make the point. Like, I don't agree with your protest, but I defend your right to protest. It's like the PM was saying half that, you know. He was saying to people, I respect your right to protest. And he's letting us fill in the other half, which is, I don't agree with your protest. So whether that was intentional or unintentional, the PM ended up signalling that he disagreed that violence against women is a problem that requires legislative change. Actually, we already know that he doesn't think this is a problem because he's sat on legislation or recommendations for changes in legislation. He sat on a report for over a year that outlines how you can make society safer for women. He's doing nothing about it. Anyway, that's my rant over. It's a bit of a rant. But it was stunning. It was upsetting and stunning what had happened in politics, what's been happening over the last few weeks. Anyway, rant over. Let's hope things change and the world becomes a safer place for women and girls. So, till next time. Ta-da.